В значительной степени тот уровень благосостояния, который достигнут в бывших колониальных державах, он основан на ограблении Африки. Это всем известно хорошо. Да, собственно, исследователи в той же самой...
When Viktor Voropayev arrived in Niamey carrying his letters from President Putin, the room was calm. The consequences were not. Within days, U.S. diplomats stopped speaking publicly about engagement and started talking about red lines. French officials halted press briefings altogether. ECOWAS officials quietly removed invasion scenarios from their planning papers. None of this happened by accident. That single appointment was locked in a security, energy, and industrial architecture that had been negotiated in silence for months. It turned Niger from a pressure point into the anchor of a new Sahel order. But why did Russia choose Niger as the center of gravity? What deal was signed long before the cameras arrived? And how did this embassy redraw the balance of power across West Africa? Let's find out. Before Viktor Voropayev ever set foot in Niamey, Niger was already under a form of siege that never made headlines. In Washington, policy briefings still used polite language about engagement and reviewing the relationship. Inside U.S. Africa Command, Niger was described very differently. The last critical node in the Sahel. Mali and Burkina Faso were already considered lost. If Niger slipped away, the entire Western security architecture across West Africa would collapse. So the pressure campaign began quietly. American military contracts were suspended, not weapons deliveries but maintenance, fuel logistics, and spare parts pipelines. Helicopters were grounded without a single missile being fired. Vehicles sat idle waiting for components that never arrived. On paper, it looked like mismanagement. In reality, it was designed for paralysis. At the same time, European development funds were frozen across agriculture, health, and infrastructure. Ministries were told technical audits were underway, but no timelines were given. Procurement stalled, salaries were delayed. The state was meant to seize up while the junta took the blame. France moved differently. French intelligence reopened channels in Tillabéri and Agadez that had been dormant for years. Tribal brokers suddenly received calls again. Old rivalries were reactivated. Promises were made. Warnings were issued. And a slow psychological war began, not to overthrow the government overnight, but to weaken it from the inside until it cracked. Then ECOWAS was activated as the final lever. Publicly, it was framed as a defense of democracy. Privately, Niger was the message to the rest of Africa. Military planners in Abuja and Accra circulated draft invasion scenarios titled Restoration Operations, complete with airspace control plans and occupation timelines. The goal was not immediate war. It was fear to make Niger feel temporary, isolated, and disposable. All this while Trump kept disrespecting Africa.
Tuesday night in Pennsylvania, President Trump admitted saying something about African countries that at the time, 2018, he denied saying, and that was whether or not he called African countries shithole countries. First, let's start with his admission Tuesday night in Pennsylvania.
We had a meeting, and I say, why is it we only take people from shithole countries, right?
Russia watched all of this unfold. Moscow understood that this was not about values. It was about keeping control of the Sahel's last strategic hinge. And it also understood something Washington missed. Pressure only works if fear still exists. In Niamey, fear had already started to fade. Fuel was rerouted through Algeria. Grain contracts were shifted away from Europe. Encrypted communications replaced Western systems. Regional commanders closed ranks instead of defecting. That adaptation changed everything. It told Russia that Niger was not waiting to be rescued. It was ready to stand. And that is what forced Moscow to move from quiet support to formal commitment. But why was Niger so valuable that the West was willing to risk war, sanctions, and regional collapse just to keep control of it? Because Niger is not just another Sahel country, it is the switchboard. For 20 years, Western strategy in West Africa was built around one idea: control Niger, and you control the Sahel. Everything else, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad, could be managed from there. That is why the U.S. built its largest drone base on the continent outside Agadez. From that runway, American aircraft watched Libya, Mali, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and the Sahara migration routes at the same time. It is why French forces treated Niamey as their logistics heart after being pushed out of Bamako. And it is why intelligence agencies describe Niger as the last uncontested corridor linking North Africa to the Gulf of Guinea. But the real prize was under the ground. Niger's uranium has powered France's nuclear plants for decades, not as a partnership, as extraction. French reactors stayed bright while Niger's towns stayed dark. Contracts were locked in at prices that barely covered costs. Value left the country. Electricity never arrived. Losing Niger means losing that system. It means France no longer controls its most sensitive energy supply. It means the US loses its Sahel airspace dominance. It means Western intelligence loses its eyes across half a continent. That is why Niger was not allowed to choose freely. When Niamey cut military ties with Paris and Washington, the Western map did not just change, it collapsed. Every supply route, every surveillance corridor, every security assumption had to be rewritten. Russia understood this immediately. Niger was not just another partner. It was the hinge that decided whether the Sahel remained a Western security zone or became an African-controlled space. And Niger also understood this. By controlling its uranium contracts, its airspace, and its transit corridors, Niger could finally negotiate from strength instead of submission. That is why the junta refused to reverse the coup under pressure. It was not stubbornness. It was a calculation.
Angela, France and the European Union, they're not delighted by this news, are they?
They're not delighted. No, as the president of Niger says, the general who is leading the junta there, this is our uranium. We will sell it to whom we want, as we wish, when we want. And that is the reality. It's true that this idea that some of it has already been seen, there are reports in international media that some uranium has already been taken to Togo, that it will from there go to Russia. These are reports in international media.
Once that decision was made, there was no path back. The embassy simply formalized a reality that already existed. Niger had chosen a different future. So if Niger is the hinge and Russia is now inside that hinge, what exactly is Moscow building there that makes this shift irreversible? By the time Viktor Voropaev arrived in Niamey, the most important decisions were already made. The embassy was not a starting point. It was the legal wrapper for a set of projects that had been negotiated quietly and then frozen into place. First came security. Russian planners and Nigerian commanders built a joint intelligence and counter-terror structure that linked Niamey, Bamako, and Ouagadougou into a single operational space. Field data from Niger's border regions was merged with Russian combat models developed in Syria and the Caucasus. Instead of chasing insurgent groups blindly, Sahel forces began working from a shared threat map that showed supply routes, financing networks, and cross-border movement patterns. Then came airspace. Russia is committed to a layered air defense corridor protecting Niger's strategic infrastructure and transport routes. This was not about symbolism. It meant Western drones could no longer operate freely. It meant any attempt to coerce Niger militarily now carried real risk. The Sahel stopped being an open sky and became a protected space. Then came energy. Rosatom and Niger's new authorities finalized a nuclear feasibility program tied directly to Niger's uranium. For the first time, uranium was not being treated as an export commodity, but as a domestic power source. Processing, enrichment partnerships, and reactor planning were aligned to keep value inside Africa. Then came food. Russia is locked in fertilizer supply chains and local production agreements, so Niger would never again be vulnerable to Western sanctions through agriculture. Grain shipments were structured not as aid, but as trade, anchored to long-term pricing. Finally came mining and industry. Instead of shipping raw ore to Europe, Russian and Nigerian teams designed processing and manufacturing capacity inside the Sahel. That single shift breaks the dependency cycle more effectively than any speech ever could. All of this was completed before a single flag was raised in Niamey. So the real question is not what the embassy represents, it is what it protects. And that leads directly to the uncomfortable question the West refuses to answer. Why did 60 years of Western partnership never build anything like this? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel. You're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Because building it would have ended their control. Western involvement in Niger was never designed to create an independent state. It was designed to keep a useful one. France did not need Niger to have electricity. It needed cheap uranium. The US did not need Niger to be industrial. It needed a surveillance hub. The EU did not need Niger to be prosperous. It needed a migration buffer. So everything was structured around extraction and containment. Security missions were permanent by design. They trained units but never transferred real capability. Equipment depended on Western spare parts. Intelligence stayed in Western hands. Niger could fight but never command. Aid followed the same logic. Projects were small, fragmented, and temporary. A clinic here, a school there. Nothing that would change the economic structure. Loans were tied to austerity, not industry. Development meant managing poverty, not ending it. Even democracy was managed. Elections were funded, observed, praised, and then ignored once the result produced leaders who followed Western priorities. When those leaders failed, the blame fell on Niger, not on the system that kept it dependent. Russia did not expose this with propaganda. It exposed it by doing the opposite. By building systems, Niger could own, operate, and defend. And once that difference became visible, the Western model collapsed under its own weight. So what changed the moment the embassy opened, when this new architecture became official? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The moment Russia's embassy became operational in Niamey, Niger stopped being an isolated state and became part of a protected network. Before that day, pressure worked because Niger stood alone. After that day, pressure stopped working because every move now carried consequences beyond West Africa. Security changed first. Any attack on Niger's infrastructure now risks direct escalation with a nuclear-armed power. That single fact removed the option of military coercion. ECOWAS quietly shelved invasion plans. Washington rewrote its contingency papers. Paris stopped issuing threats and started recalculating supply chains. Then diplomacy changed. Sanctions no longer isolate Niger. They push it deeper into Russian, Chinese, and BRICS trade systems. Every attempt to punish Niamey now strengthens the alternative networks that the West cannot control. Then economics changed. Uranium pricing, fertilizer supply, energy planning, and mining contracts are no longer Western levers. They are negotiated through Niamey, not Paris. For the first time, Niger is shaping its own bargaining power instead of reacting to it. The embassy did not create this shift. It locked it in, it made reversal expensive, dangerous, and politically impossible. So the West's last advantage, fear, finally disappeared. And once fear disappears, control disappears with it. So where does this road actually lead now that the balance has tipped? The Russian embassy in Niamey is not the end of this story. It is the point where the future becomes unavoidable.
Но, тем не менее, хотел бы отметить, что в этом году мы уже отметили 65 лет установления дипломатических отношений. Как ни странно, за это время у нас не были открыты посольства, и вот мы наконец договорились об этом. В следующем году открываем посольство в обеих странах.
From here, Niger is no longer negotiating from weakness. It is designing its own security doctrine, its own energy system, and its own industrial base. That changes the internal politics of the country, the balance inside the Sahel, and the way Africa engages the world. Other governments are watching closely, not because they admire Russia, but because they recognize the mechanism Niger has unlocked. Real leverage comes from owning security, energy, food, and industry at the same time. Without that combination, sovereignty is a slogan. With it, sovereignty becomes a fact. The West understands this too. That is why the language has shifted from supporting democracy to containing influence. That is why pressure has turned into silence. And that is why Africa's future is no longer being written in Paris or Washington. It is being written in places like Niamey, Bamako, and Ouagadougou by governments that stopped asking permission and started building power. And this shift is already changing how Africans see themselves on the world stage. For the first time in a generation, leaders in the Sahel are not measuring success by Western approval, donor conferences, or IMF praise, but by whether roads are built, fields are irrigated, and security actually improves in people's daily lives. Regional cooperation is no longer a slogan. It is becoming a practical tool for survival, linking economies, transport corridors, and security forces into something that can stand on its own. The significance of Russia's embassy is not the flag over a building, but the confidence it gives these governments to plan 10 and 20 years, a horizon Africa was never allowed to imagine before. What makes this moment irreversible is not Russia's presence alone, but the way it has exposed how fragile the old system really was. Western influence in the Sahel survived because it controlled the rules, the financing, and the narrative. Now those three pillars are being challenged at the same time. New trade routes are bypassing Europe, local currencies are being discussed for regional settlement, and African governments are coordinating policy instead of competing for donor attention. That combination is quietly dismantling the machinery that kept the continent dependent, replacing it with something far harder to control: African decision-making. And beyond the Sahel, the ripple effects are already spreading across the continent. Governments in Central, East, and Southern Africa are studying Niger's experience not as an act of defiance, but as a case study in leverage, how a country can turn geography, resources, and alliances into bargaining power instead of vulnerability. This is changing diplomatic behavior in real time. African leaders are negotiating harder, delaying commitments, and demanding technology transfer rather than symbolic aid. The embassy in Niamey has become a reference point, a reminder that Africa is no longer condemned to inherit the futures designed for it by others, but is beginning to design its own. So the final question is not whether Russia will stay in Niger. It is whether Africa will ever accept being ruled from the outside again. Let us know in the comment section, is Niger finally free? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.